This is another event, penultimate, not quite the last. We'll be coming back next week with yet another one in our commemoration of the centennial of the armistice that brought to an end the Great War, which of course, as our principal speaker explained, didn't really come to quite an end with the armistice, and in fact has never come to an end to this very day. Its shadow lingers on all of the subsequent history, not only of the 20th century, but still into the 21st in a whole variety of ways. So it's been our great pleasure to sort of bring together a variety of faculty talents and our principal speaker from Yale University, Jay Winter, to address from a variety of angles what the Great War was all about and what it means for us today. We wouldn't be able to do any of this were it not for a generous grant from the CH Foundation, to whom we are greatly indebted, and of course the participation of many people in the faculty and the student body. So thank you all. We have, after today's event, as I said, one more, and that will be part of our mini movie series. Earlier this week, or actually, sorry, the week before, we showed the first Academy Award-winning film, which was about the First World War, the aerial part of the First World War, and it was called Wings, silent film. Our next film, and this will indeed be the concluding event of the series, is probably the most famous movie that was made about the First World War, based on the most famous book that was written about the war, All Quiet on the Western Front. And we will be showing that next Thursday, November 29th, right here in the Lubbock Room at 6 p.m. As you can see from the poster, popcorn will be available, as well as sodas. We probably should have retitled the film All's A-Popping on the Western Front. You can kind of chew your... No, sorry.
Will the doors here be locked?
Absolutely. I don't want all and sundry coming in and eating the popcorn. So many people who want to come and see the movie will be allowed to do that. Today, a very special treat in that we have not only a member of Texas Tech's faculty, but also a graduate of Texas Tech, a man who received his PhD from our history department. I've known him for many years. He is Dr. Michael Rollin. Dr. Rollin did his work on American diplomatic history, and particularly on the history of naval diplomacy. And that's what he'll be talking about today, because as the First World War drew to an end, there was increasing diplomatic tension and diplomatic maneuvering having to do with the role that the great naval powers of the day, the victorious ones, namely Britain and the United States, would play in the post-war world, and in fact the whole relationship that they would have in the post-Great War world. So, Michael has had an unusually wide experience in teaching different courses and teaching through different media. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to give a public lecture at Texas Tech before, but this will add to your resume. And so let me introduce Dr. Michael Rollin.
Okay. Yes, yeah, this is my first public lecture at Texas Tech. But of course, as a grad student and then later as a visiting assistant professor, I taught courses here for a few years. And of course, I've been attending these sorts of lectures here put on by the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization since Dr. Balch arrived here in 2012. So, and now for the first time, I'm one of the ones giving the lectures. So, anyway, I'll get into the subject. And I'm going to be talking about the Great War in Anglo-American naval diplomacy, specifically from 1916 through 1922. Now, then there's a specific reason why I start with 1916, and but before getting into that, just to explain the situation going into this matter. During the later years of the Great War, and then from there continuing into the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and then from there into the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922, the tenor of relations between the United States and the United Kingdom was growing increasingly tense, and what I'm going to do here with this lecture is explore the nature of those tensions, identifying what caused them and how officials from both nations addressed them. And at this time, despite that tension, the United States and the United Kingdom were on generally friendly terms with one another. And of course, indeed, the United States would not have entered the Great War on the side of Britain and the Allied powers otherwise, but the so-called special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom was still more than 2 decades into the future. And you have to keep in mind, too, that we had fought 2 wars with Great Britain, the first, of course, being the Revolutionary War, and then after that, the War of 1812. And then there had been some tension between the United States and Great Britain during the Civil War, when it looked like Britain might support the Confederacy, or at least grant the Confederacy diplomatic recognition. And but even so, the nature of the relationship was better, in 1916 than it had been in 1816, considerably so. But the tensions did remain. And the Paris Peace Conference, when it convened early in 1919 after the armistice had been signed that stopped the fighting in World War I, was fraught with many political, diplomatic, and military roadblocks, one of which was Prime Minister David Lloyd George's desire to have Britain maintain the naval dominance that it had so carefully and painstakingly crafted over the course of nearly 3 centuries. And this contrasted with President Woodrow Wilson's particular method of crafting a stable and peaceful post-war world that he had expressed with his 14 points, or during his 14 points speech early in 1918. Many British officials viewed Wilson's 14 points as being dangerously naive, and some even doubted Wilson's sincerity. They wondered whether he actually meant what he was saying in those 14 points, thinking that maybe he had a darker motive for his call for international disarmament, namely the dissolution of British naval supremacy. And the British themselves believed that their naval dominance had done much to ensure collective security and international peace and prosperities in the high seas for nearly a century prior to the outbreak of the Great War. And they viewed calls for such measures as a League of Nations Navy and an explicit guarantee of freedom of the seas, neither of which were ultimately included in the Covenant of the League of Nations, by the way, as a direct assault upon their naval preeminence, and an unnecessary one. And even though the British were correct in arguing that Royal Navy supremacy was not incompatible with the League of Nations and had historical precedent to back up their argument, the Wilson administration believed that peace in the high seas would best be guaranteed by achieving a global balance of power between the major naval powers. But how that balance might be achieved at this point in 1916, and even later at 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, that remained very much an open question. And the British also believed that they had sufficient reason to doubt Wilson's stated desire for world peace, particularly in light of the U.S. naval expansion programs of 1916 and 1919. And likewise, the repeated British complaints about U.S. naval expansion raised American concerns that Britain might be seeking to restore its once overpowering naval primacy, which had seriously been reduced over the previous 2 decades. And so what I'm going to do tonight is explore the origins of this Anglo-American tension and explain how it was resolved and how the foundation was set then for the eventual Anglo-American special relationship. And as I mentioned, the big reason that the British were getting concerned early on was that a naval expansion program had been enacted in 1916 by President Wilson. Now, he had called for naval expansion. Legislation was introduced into Congress. It was passed. And there was a reason for that. It just didn't come out of the blue. Wilson had a good reason for calling for this naval expansion. And the initial reason had nothing to do with Great Britain, but rather it had to do with an event that had occurred the previous year in 1915. And that was the German sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania. Lusitania was sunk on May 17th, 1915. All hands aboard were lost, including 128 Americans. And Wilson, 2 months after the tragedy, that is in July of 1915, President Wilson directed his Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, and also his Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, to begin preparing a program of massive naval expansion with the intent of enabling the United States to fight a two-ocean naval war. This incident with the Lusitania sufficiently alarmed Wilson that he thought we need to have our naval capabilities brought up to the highest level possible. While the German high seas fleet had been bottled up in the Adriatic and only their submarines could get out into the Atlantic, who knew what might happen in the future? There was no guarantee that the Allies were going to win the war. Now, this call for a massive naval expansion was an example of Wilson's adoption of what was referred to as the preparedness doctrine. And the preparedness doctrine called for a navy that would be large enough to fight in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And should a navy contrive a landing on American shores, a trained conscript army, at least 1 million strong, that would repel the invaders. It was Wilson's belief that a navy that, in his words, was equal to the most powerful would deter further aggression against Americans and act as a none too subtle diplomatic weapon. Furthermore, if an expanded navy and army could not become a reality while the Great War was still underway, in the war's aftermath it might serve as insurance in the event of a challenge to American security by the war's victors. And he just notice how he said, by the war's victors. He didn't say, well, who might those victors be? You might assume Germany, the Central Powers, but he could easily have been referring to, Britain. There was no guarantee that the generally friendly relationship might continue. Well, several months later, at a re-election campaign rally in St. Louis, Missouri, on February 3rd of 1916, President Wilson said, a direct quote from his speech, "There is no other navy in the world that has to cover so great an area of defense as the American Navy, and it ought, in my judgment, to be incomparably the greatest in the world." Unquote. That statement of Wilson's caused some controversy. Senator Benjamin Tillman, chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, Pitchfork Ben, he urged Wilson to back away from it. And indeed, Wilson did so. When an official transcript was drawn up of his speech, that term, incomparably the greatest, was rewritten as incomparably the most adequate. But that's kind of like trying to unring a bell. I mean, people had already heard the original version that had gotten out, so what was really the point? Well, the Naval Expansion Program was introduced by President Wilson at the recommendation of the General Board of the United States Navy. And according to the initial plan, the plan was to raise the U.S. Navy up to be the equal of the most powerful navy maintained by any other nation in the world. And the goal was to have that objective achieved by 1925. And after a tumultuous debate in the Senate and House, the expansion program was approved on August 15th of 1916. Wilson signed it into law shortly thereafter. And what this program called for was the construction of 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 10 scout cruisers, 50 destroyers, 60 submarines, and 13 auxiliary ships. So it was a massive expansion. And the timetable, or rather the program itself, was set to unfold over the course of 3 years, with immediate construction to begin on 4 battleships, 4 battle cruisers, 4 scout ships, and 54 additional vessels as to be determined. Now, in light of this, well, the question is raised. Germany was undoubtedly seen as a serious naval threat, but was it the only threat? Wilson's support for this program was intended not only to prepare for a possible war with Germany, but also to provide the United States with a multi-purpose weapon for intimidating other countries capable of threatening the United States with their naval might, potentially even the British. Now, Wilson, among his advisors, one of his top advisors was a Texan, a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House. And Colonel House warned Wilson about the problems that the expansion program might cause to relations with Great Britain. And this was Wilson's response: "Let us build a navy bigger than hers and do what we please." And others that also supported, other politicians that supported the expansion program, were even more direct. One, Representative William Stevens, Republican of California, said the United States, in his words, must be prepared to defend herself from attack from any other nation and be fairly prepared to repel Great Britain. See, an actual member of Congress saying that. Another one, Representative Richmond Hobson, a Democrat from Alabama, warned about Britain trying to weaken American influence over Mexico, which was then in the middle of a violent revolution, and urged the United States to go beyond what was authorized in the 1916 program, building a fleet that would be larger than the combined British and Japanese navies. Now, to be sure, Hobson's opinion was rather extreme, but there were still others in the House who shared his concerns. Representative George Foss, the ranking Republican on the House Naval Affairs Committee, worried of Britain challenging the Monroe Doctrine in the near future. And Representative Simeon Fess declared, quote, "England's present attitude toward our rights are ominous." And he chastised critics who dismissed the notion of another conflict with Britain, saying anyone who did so, quote, "refuses to look into what has taken place in the last 100 years, unquote. And then there was Senator Claude Swanson, Democrat of Virginia, added that Britain had imposed, in his words, unjust restrictions upon the neutral United States during the early years of the Great War, and no less a figure than Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the Senate Minority Leader, added that the United States should have two large fleets in the Atlantic and Pacific to dissuade enemy action either in the east or west. And these concerns would once again be made manifest late in 1918 as the Great War drew to an end and Allied victory was imminent. Now, when the United States actually did enter the Great War, this program was temporarily suspended, mainly because it was determined that the United States would have to focus more on destroyer production, because the big responsibilities, that the two major responsibilities that the U.S. would have during the war would be convoy protection, so that the American Expeditionary Force could make it over there to France, and the other was anti-submarine duty, as, of course, German submarines were taking a terrible toll on Allied convoys in the Atlantic. There were also American battleships assigned to work alongside the British Grand Fleet, which was headquartered at Scapa Flow in Scotland, in preparation for a possible major naval fleet battle. Apparently there was some concern that maybe the Germans might try to challenge the Royal Navy again like they had at Jutland, but that second battle never came to fruition. So the U.S. Navy never saw any true fleet action during the First World War, though they did a lot with anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection. The war came to an end on November 11th of 1918. The Allied forces were victorious. And by late 1918, many American naval officials were wondering what course the Anglo-American naval relationship might take once the war was formally ended. And at this point, the United States was already considering implementing a repeat of the 1960 Naval Expansion Program, which did cause some concern, even amongst high-ranking U.S. naval officials who worried about whether the British might react poorly to that. One of the critics was Captain William Vesey Pratt, who was the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations. And he sent a note to his boss, Admiral William Shepard Benson, the Chief of Naval Operations, stating, quote, "The proposed shipbuilding program of the United States will throw a bombshell into the British camp." And Pratt also spent a lot of time trying to reassure the highest ranking British naval official in North America, Admiral William Grant, who was the commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies station, that the United States and Britain were like a family. And he explained that he implored Admiral Grant to consider that the United States was like a son who had grown up and wished equal representation with the father, and that an expanded navy did not necessarily represent hostile intent toward British interests. Well, so there were concerns about a British reaction. Another concern, too, was the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance that had been in place since 1902. As Japan was an emerging power around the turn of the century, and with Britain wanting to maintain its hold on its own East Asian interests, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and other locations, it was decided that the prudent course of action was to enter into an alliance with the Japanese Empire, and that would ensure that Japan would not pose a threat to Britain's interests in East Asia, and it would also financially benefit Britain because they would not have to expend a lot of money to defend their East Asian territories. So it made sense from the British standpoint in that regard, and the Japanese too, because in this relationship they were now a co-equal with the largest naval power in the world. But there was a constant fear on the part of American naval officials that what if this alliance is ever turned against us? Now, officially, the terms of the Anglo-Japanese naval alliance stated, that they limited the alliance, saying that they didn't necessarily have to be allied with one another against every hostile power. There would be a certain context involved, so determining on who was the aggressor, who was defending, and so it didn't necessarily imply that there would be an Anglo-Japanese alliance against us, but still the possibility was there, and there was a big concern about it. Well, once the war was over, the old 1916 Naval Expansion Program had been reactivated, and even just and that, in combination with the proposed 1919 program, according to the General Board of the U.S. Navy, was to achieve the goal of giving the United States a navy at least equal to any other by 1925. With this proposed 1919 expansion program, there would be 10 additional battleships added to the fleet. That is, in addition to what was already called for under the 1916 program, 6 new battle cruisers, and that would bring the total, if all of this was completed, to 39 battleships and 12 battle cruisers. This would not only make the U.S. Navy as large, it would not make the United States Navy as large as the Royal Navy, it would make it larger, and also qualitatively better, since these would be newer ships than the Royal Navy had. And another problem for the Royal Navy, too, was that they were running out of money. In fact, this was true of just Britain overall. They had expended a lot of money to come out, the victor of World War I. They also, in the aftermath of World War I, would acquire a lot of new territory, especially in Africa, that had once been held by the Germans. And they were hurting financially. And so that was yet another reason that the British were looking at this whole situation very warily. Now, because there was considerable doubt that Congress would have approved this proposed 1919 program, with World War I having just ended, some historians have speculated that the sole purpose of this proposed 1919 expansion program was not to actually grow the size of the U.S. Navy, but rather to force the British to agree to either the creation of a League of Nations Navy or a naval arms limitation agreement that would mandate British-American naval parity. Now, the League of Nations Navy, that might sound a bit outrageous to us now, but that was under serious discussion amongst top U.S. Navy officials in the aftermath of the First World War. But there were some logistical issues that a League of Nations Navy might face, where it might be headquartered, how it might be structured, matters relating to personnel, materiel, bases, what countries would be participating, and what they would be expected to contribute. And the British saw such a proposal as an attempt to undermine their naval supremacy. And the Admiralty soon made it clear that they did not care at all for the idea. Now, whether the U.S. Navy or even the Wilson administration thought that the League of Nations Navy proposal had any real chance of being implemented is unclear from the available correspondence. Well, the British reaction, of course, to this, whether it was the 1919 expansion program or the proposed League of Nations Navy, was quite negative. The 1919 expansion program was considered by many British officials to be inconsistent and illogical. And another problem was that the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, was misquoted in a British newspaper called, or actually it was a magazine called the Fortnightly Review. A writer for that publication named Archibald Hurd had quoted Daniels as telling the British that they could quote, either join the utopians, throw down the trident, or have the trident taken from you. Problem is, he didn't say it. It was a misquotation. But that added to the acrimony. And then amongst British officials themselves, there was one who noted that America was proposing to build, quote, the type of vessels we cannot afford to build. And the Royal Navy couldn't. And then there was also the question about how was naval expansion reconcilable with President Wilson's call for a League of Nations or a League of Nations Navy. Wouldn't that imply disarmament rather than expansion? And then there was also some concern on the part of British officials, where some perceived that there was rising anti-British sentiment in America. Was there? Kind of questionable, because there was rising criticism in the United States over whether or not we should have been involved in the Great War, especially when the casualties became known. Ultimately, the United States had lost about, I think it was around 120,000 men during the war, with an additional 230,000 wounded, some gravely, due to either what was called shell shock or actually being wounded in battle, whether by firearms or, of course, by chemical weapons. And so there was this fear on the part of the British that maybe they thought the American public would blame the British for having conned us into the war. From what I can tell, that doesn't seem to really have been the case. If there was anger, but it was directed not at the British, but at the Wilson administration. And in fact, that would be made manifest in the next presidential election in 1920, when the Democrats suffered a massive landslide loss, with the Republican candidate Warren Harding being swept into power over the Democratic candidate John Cox, with nearly 60% of the popular vote, one of the biggest presidential landslides in American history. Well, in any case, the 1920 election was a bit in the future, but we'll look now at what was going on in Paris, specifically at the Paris Peace Conference. Well, there was an incident, a diplomatic row at the Paris Peace Conference between American and British diplomats and officials from their respective navies. And this big row was termed the Sea Battle of Paris by Josephus Daniels. And it occurred over the course of a few weeks from late March to early April of 1919. And like I said, the term was coined by Josephus Daniels. Well, here's how it started. At a meeting between American and British officials in late March of 1919 that involved Navy Secretary Daniels, Admiral Benson, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the First Sea Lord, Roslin Wemyss, that's the head of the British Royal Navy. Well, there was a meeting where what happened was that Wemyss had heard that Josephus Daniels had arrived in Paris. He found out where he was staying, and so he went to pay a personal call to the Navy Secretary. Well, Admiral Benson, who was also in Paris as a member of the official U.S. delegation, heard of the meeting. And when he did, he raced over to where Secretary Daniels was staying, because he feared that the less experienced Daniels might be tricked by Admiral Wemyss into revealing information about the naval expansion programs. And when Wemyss pointedly asked Daniels why the United States was continuing to rapidly grow its Navy despite the war being over, Benson immediately asked Daniels not to answer the question, and that brought the impromptu meeting to an abrupt conclusion. But then during a formal conference between officials from both countries that followed later that same afternoon, and no specific date was given for this initial meeting in the diplomatic correspondence. Why that was the case, I don't know. But Daniels himself noted considerable animosity between the two heads of the respective navies. That is, between Admiral William Benson and Admiral Rosalind Wemyss. Daniels wrote in his own correspondence that, quote, he had never seen two men of their high standing so infuriated as Admiral Benson and Admiral Wemyss in that conversation. They exchanged such bitter comments that at one time I feared they would pass the bounds and have an altercation, unquote. Fortunately, the recriminations never reached that level. Partly, Daniels thought to his own calming influence. And Daniels added that the British admiral thought that his country ought to have the right to build the biggest navy in the world, and that we ought to agree to it. To Benson, that would have been treason to his own country. So you can see how far apart they were, unquote. And the acrimony between Benson and Wemyss underscored a larger volatility present in post-World War I Anglo-American relations. Well, in a later memorandum to President Wilson about the ongoing meetings with the British, Secretary Daniels recounted that Prime Minister David Lloyd George responded to Benson's insistence on naval parity, quote, saying that he would not give a snap of his finger for the League of Nations if we, that is the United States, kept on building, that is, building our Navy. And Daniels then explained to Lloyd George that the 1916 expansion program is already well underway and could not be stopped unless Congress approved legislation halting the program. And he added that even when the program was complete, Britain would still have a numerical advantage in capital and non-capital ships alike. And Lloyd George quickly countered by saying that although Daniels was right, the United States would nonetheless have an advantage over Britain, because newer American capital ships would be superior to the British ones in terms of firepower. And Walter Long, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty, that is the British equivalent to our Secretary of the Navy, voiced agreement with Lloyd George, adding that he too would like to see the 1916 program ended. Well, at that meeting, Long and Admiral Benson then clashed. And at one point, Benson gave a very blunt response to Long's assertion that the British Empire would at all hazards seek to retain its naval primacy over America. And here's what Benson said. He said, "Well, Mr. Long, if you and the other members of your government continue to act along the lines you were traveling this morning, I can assure you that it will mean one thing, and that is war between Great Britain and the United States." Wow. So this gentleman, Admiral Benson, was really throwing some bombs at these meetings. He was just not having any of what the British were saying. Well, in light of this, you can see that the Sea Battle of Paris was threatening to seriously disrupt the proceedings of the Paris Peace Conference. And so it was decided that in order to prevent this diplomatic row from going on, there needed to be some kind of agreement reached to, at the very least, settle this dispute at a later date. Well, a couple of American and British officials got together, one being Lord Robert Cecil, the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and Colonel Edward House, who was acting as President Wilson's effective minister without portfolio for foreign policy at the Paris Peace Conference. They got together and they worked out an agreement, and it was this. It was called the Cecil House Agreement, enacted on April 10th of 1919, and they produced a 4-point compromise to end the diplomatic impasse. One was that the United States would postpone new ship construction and that it would abandon the 1919 expansion program. And at some point in the future, the United States and the United Kingdom would hold a naval conference to discuss possible matters of disarmament. But until that conference was held, the two navies would consult with one another annually on ship production so that each would be fully aware of what the other was doing. And so there wouldn't be any further cause for alarm or officials claiming, surprise that, that they didn't know what was actually going on in terms of naval expansion. So this set the foundation for what was to follow, and that was the Washington Conference. But first, before anything like the Washington Conference could be dealt with, the Paris Peace Conference had to deal with the matters of formally ending the Great War, producing treaties between the Allied powers and the Central powers, and formally bringing the war to an end, which they did. There were a number of treaties produced. Of course, the one we're most familiar with, the Treaty of Versailles, was eventually rejected by the United States Senate because of the covenant of the League of Nations and concerns that the military requirements called for by the League might drag us into another war, which was looked upon by the American public very poorly. Well, in the meantime, there was a presidential election. Warren G. Harding, the U.S. Senator from Ohio, and his running mate, Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts, were elected in a landslide over the Democratic ticket of Governor John Cox of Ohio and Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Democrats had hoped that having the Roosevelt name on their ticket might help their chances because of memories of Theodore Roosevelt, who was Franklin Roosevelt's distant cousin and who had passed away a year earlier in 1919. Perhaps they thought that might help, but it didn't. The Democratic ticket was wiped out. And so President Harding had been elected president, promising to refocus American foreign policy to one that was based more on American national interests rather than this more vague concept of internationalism. One of the great myths or misstatements about Harding is that he was an isolationist. He was nothing of the sort. If you want, you can call him an Americanist, a unilateralist, but he was not an isolationist. That there really weren't any more isolationists anymore, except for maybe a few extremist outliers in Congress and the House and Senate. But that the horse had already left the barn in terms of that. There was no going back to the way things had been, say prior to the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt or William McKinley. That's ignoring the affairs of the rest of the world was no longer going to be an option. Nonetheless, when Harding came into the presidency, one of the big foreign policy issues you had to deal with was to have the United States sign a formal treaty between the two countries you'd been at war with in World War I, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Well, of course, Austria-Hungary didn't exist anymore. It was now two separate independent countries, but legislation, treaties were drawn up rather, and they were signed by President Harding and the relevant Austrian and German officials, and then ratified by the Senate. And after that, then, the next big item on the agenda was to deal with this lingering naval dispute with Great Britain. And as the conference was put together, it was decided that it should be more than just a bilateral conference. They needed to have all of the major naval powers present to produce a secure and lasting balance of power. And so the Washington Naval Conference was called by the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, and it was significant for these two reasons. It was the first international conference ever held in the United States. And it was also the first disarmament conference ever held in all of world history. For the first time ever, countries would be meeting to agree to reduce arms. And that had never been done before. Like I said, it was organized by Charles Evans Hughes. And in total, there were 9 countries that participated in the conference. That was all of the Allied powers plus one neutral country, that being the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands had been neutral during the Great War, but it was decided to include them in the conference given their vast territorial holdings in Southeast Asia, mainly the Dutch East Indies, what is nowadays known as Indonesia. And these were all the participants: the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, France, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, China, and the Netherlands. And all but the Netherlands had been part of the Allied powers during the Great War. Well, the conference lasted for about 3 months. It convened in November of 1921. It concluded in February of 1922. And it was successful. There were a number of treaties that came out of the conference, the most important of which was this one, the Five-Power Naval Limitation Treaty, signed onto by the US, UK, Japan, France, and Italy. And it was decided between the powers that there would be certain limits set on capital ship tonnage, that is, the tonnage of battleships and battle cruisers. The United States and the United Kingdom agreed to limit the total size of their capital ship tonnage to 525,000 tons. Japan agreed to limit theirs to 315,000, and then France and Italy limited theirs to 175,000 each. And these limits were determined by the relative commitments each of these navies had in defending their territories and regional interests. The next treaty that was produced was the Four-Power Pact. The Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance was formally dissolved with the signing of this treaty. And four countries, the US, UK, Japan, and France, agreed going forward to respect one another's territorial claims in the Pacific and East Asia. And this was done, of course, to assure the British that their territories would remain safe. The Americans got guarantees then that the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam would also be respected by Japan. France got guarantees for its own territories, like French Indochina. But since this was a multilateral agreement, the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance was incompatible with it, and so it was decided that that alliance would not be renewed. And then there was a nine-power treaty where all of the participants essentially agreed to continue to respect the so-called open door policy with China, where all would enjoy the same trading privileges with China. And then there was also an international committee set up to monitor Chinese tariffs, to make sure the Chinese government was not overcharging certain countries at the expense of others. So those were the three major ones that came out. Then there were a number of smaller ones, like the Shantung Treaty, that had to do with some territory that Japan had seized from Germany and China in 1914. That territory was returned to China. There's the Five-Power Supplemental Treaty. I believe that one had to do with submarines. And it was, there were some, this is a little kind of funny, there were some participants at the conference that wanted to actually ban the submarine. And of course that's just totally ridiculous. I mean, that's trying to, good luck, it'd be like trying to ban the wheel or ban the internet. I mean, the technology was out there, had been out there for some time. And there was this fear that somehow submarines were invincible, but of course, that was, had been shown not to be the case during the Great War. And of course, in World War II, by that point, anti-submarine methods were very sophisticated. But but all of the signatories agreed that there would be a procedure for submarines, that instead of just shooting at a ship that they perceived as being hostile, they would surface, then board the ship, and then if it was determined that the ship was carrying arms, then they would make sure the crew was put on some island, and then they would take the ship out and sink it with nobody aboard. It was completely unrealistic. I mean, there's no way anyone was going to follow that, but it made them feel good. And then there were the Six-Power Pact and Yap Island Agreement that had to do with the construction of trans-Pacific cables for telephone communication. And overall, it was, like I said, this was a successful conference. It established what came to be known as the Washington Treaty System, and it remained in effect for 14 years. And it worked during the time that it was in effect. What killed it was the rise of a militarist government in Japan, who decided that the limitations they had agreed to, specifically with the Five-Power Treaty, that first one, were too restrictive. And so in 1934, Japan gave 2 years' notice that by December 31st of 1936, they were withdrawing from the treaty, as they were legally permitted to do so under the treaty system. And so when Japan withdrew, then essentially the treaties just became useless. But this was, this for a while established a successful multilateral framework. It addressed political differences and arms control together. And it also did establish a precedent that foreshadowed the coming special relationship between the United States and Britain. Now, so overall, the Washington Conference was a positive event within this larger construct of global diplomacy. And at the very least, the Washington Treaty System was a limited success that was tarnished by the later failures of 1930s diplomacy. But some historians have liked to characterize the Washington Conference as just being, a big, just a big joke and having been, accomplished nothing meaningful. That just wasn't true. I mean, the treaties worked, just so long as everyone that had signed them was willing to go along with them. But then when Japan pulled out, well, that just brought the whole thing tumbling down. And just as kind of a sidebar to all of this, too, you can't understate the tension that did exist between the United States and Canada. And nowhere was this tension higher, though, than in North America. Because think about it, there was one country during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 where there had been heavy or significant fighting on land, and that was what today is Canada. In fact, during both of those wars, American forces had invaded British Canada, both in the Revolutionary War and during the War of 1812. Well, after World War I was over, after the Great War was over, a war in which Canada had lent significant numbers of troops to, there was one gentleman who had distinguished himself at several major battles in World War I, an officer in the Canadian military named James Sutherland Brown. His nickname was Buster. And he had a very distinguished record. He had won all kinds of service medals for combat at several major battles. I can't recall all of them off the top of my head, but these were major battles in which lots of people died. Well, when he came home to Canada after the war, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel when he was out in the field. And when he came home, he was promoted up to full colonel and was put in charge of Canadian military intelligence and operations. And he was charged with coming up with contingency war plans should Canada find itself going to war once again. And so Colonel Sutherland Brown put together a staff. And they thought, well, what military conflicts are most likely? They came up with 3 plans which are called defense schemes. Defense scheme number 3 was based on the possibility of Canadian forces having to once again be deployed for Europe for some future possible conflict, which is what they had done during the Great War. Defense scheme number 2 envisioned a possible war in the Pacific between Canada and Japan. Somewhat unlikely scenario since Canada did not, have any territories in close proximity to Japan like we did. Then there was defense scheme number 1, and that was easily the most famous or infamous of the 3, because that entailed the possibility of war with the United States on land. And so Colonel Sutherland Brown and his staff put together a detailed plan for how the United States, or how Canada rather, would deal with war with the United States. And he determined that given the vast disparity in size between the United States Army and the Canadian Army, Canada's best option was to go on offense first. That is, if war was ever declared between the United States and Canada, Canadian forces would attack first en masse all across the border from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And it would push into American territory, seizing major cities like Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Fargo, Detroit, and even push deep into New England and upstate New York. The idea being that would buy Canada just enough time to get British Army reinforcements into their country. Well, I bring that up because, this tension was real, and it wasn't just the British who had noticed, it was the Canadians. And Canada, as it happens by law, they were required to coordinate their foreign policy with Great Britain until 1926. It wasn't until 1926, after Canada had been independent for just under I guess that would have been just about 50 years that they finally, or was it 60 years, that they finally gained the ability the right to conduct foreign policy separate from that of Britain. And there's always been an open question about just how much the British knew about the Canadian war planning. It's it's difficult to determine from the available documentation and correspondence. But fortunately, the situation between the United States and Britain and its dominions never did descend to that point. But anyway, this was, I think, just an interesting subtext to what was going on during the later years of the Great War and the early years of the interwar period. So I believe that's it, yes. So.